Ontario, the heart of Canada, a place people picture as safe, familiar, ordinary. Rows of farmhouses under big skies, suburban streets lined with maple trees, cities that never really sleep. But beneath that quiet rhythm, there are stories that have carved deep scars into this province's history. Stories that remind us that darkness doesn't choose one place over another. It hides where we least expect it. In this special feature, we travel the roads and neighborhoods of Ontario to revisit 5 of its darkest true crime cases. From a biker brotherhood turned slaughter in a lonely field, to a family that drowned its own honor in a Kingston canal, from the abduction of a teenage girl whose innocence still haunts the Niagara region, to the murder of a child in Woodstock that broke an entire community's heart, and finally, a day on a street in Toronto when hate itself took the wheel. 5 stories, 5 moments when the light went out. These aren't tales of monsters from the woods or ghosts in the dark. They're stories of people, ordinary, flawed, and human, and the choices that turned them into nightmares. This is Northern Nightmares, and these are the darkest true crime cases from Ontario. It began in the stillness of an April morning, the kind of quiet only rural Ontario can hold. A field outside the hamlet of Shedden, an open stretch of farmland, the sky pale and empty. By the time the sun climbed above the barns, the scene was already crawling with police. 8 bodies lay scattered across 4 abandoned vehicles, some slumped inside, some half hidden by doors left ajar. The ground was slick with early spring mud and something darker. April 8, 2006, the day Ontario learned that an outlaw motorcycle club had torn itself apart from the inside out. The headlines called it the Shedden Massacre. The story starts years earlier with a group of men who believed they were brothers, the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, Ontario chapter. They wore the patch, lived the code, and believed they were part of something bigger than themselves. But underneath the chrome and bravado was a storm building, rivalries, suspicion, pride, and at the center of it all, a man named Wayne Celestine, a longtime biker with a reputation for volatility, a love of guns, and an ego as loud as his Harley. By early 2006, the Ontario chapter was collapsing under the weight of its own dysfunction. Members accused each other of stealing, of lying, of bringing shame to the patch. The national leadership had ordered an internal church meeting, a kind of disciplinary council. It was supposed to settle scores. Instead, it became a trap. In the early hours of April 7th, 8 men, all bandidos, gathered at Celestine's farm near Iona Station, just south of London, Ontario. What they didn't know was that only one side of that meeting would walk away. The details of what happened inside that farmhouse are still stitched together from fragments of testimony, crime scene evidence, and the accounts of those who later turned on each other in court. But the picture that emerges is grim. The men were ordered to surrender their guns, stripped of their patches, and told they'd been bad for the club. Celestine paced the barn with a rifle. He'd been drinking. He was paranoid. He told the men they were being expelled from the Bandidos, that they weren't real brothers anymore. Then, somewhere between drunken rage and cold calculation, the expulsion became execution. One by one, the 8 men were shot, some outside, some forced to kneel inside the barn. Others tried to run and were hunted down. When the gunfire stopped, Celestine and a few accomplices loaded the bodies into vehicles and drove them 20 minutes east to a farmer's field outside Shedden. They left them there like discarded cargo and drove off into the dark. When the first patrol officer arrived the next morning, he thought it was a traffic accident. Then he looked inside the cars. The RCMP and Ontario Provincial Police descended on the scene within hours. It was one of the largest crime scenes in Canadian history. 8 dead, every one of them a member of the same club. News spread fast. Reporters called it a biker war, a massacre, a purge. But for the people of Elgin County, it was something else entirely, a shockwave. The idea that a small Ontario farm could become the stage for mass murder didn't fit the picture of country quiet they'd always known. Over the following weeks, investigators pieced together a timeline that read like something out of Scorsese film set against cornfields instead of concrete. Ballistics, tire tracks, phone records, even the cigarettes left behind, every clue pointed back to the Celestine farm. Within days, arrests began. Wayne Celestine was taken into custody along with 5 other men linked to the Bandidos: Michael Sandom, Frank Mather, Mark Muscadere, and others who had once called themselves friends. The trials that followed were massive. The courthouse in London, Ontario, became the epicenter of a legal storm. More than a year of testimony, over 200 witnesses, and mountains of evidence. The public sat stunned as prosecutors described the betrayal, the humiliation, and finally the execution of 8 men who never saw it coming. The defense tried to paint Celestine as unstable, paranoid, a man who'd lost control of reality. But the jury saw something colder, a power struggle disguised as loyalty, and a killer who wanted to prove he still mattered in a crumbling world of outlaw pride. In 2009, 6 men were found guilty of first-degree murder, life sentences, no chance of parole for 25 years. The verdicts brought closure on paper, but not in spirit. Families of the victims wept. Some of the convicted showed no emotion. Celestine smirked as he was led away. If you visit that stretch of road today, you wouldn't know what happened there. The field is just a field again, green in summer, gold in fall, quiet all year. The farmhouse still stands, its siding weather-stained and forgotten. But for the people who live nearby, the memory hasn't faded. It lingers in small ways, in the way headlights slow at night when they pass the old gate, or how farmers lock their barns now, just in case. The Shedden Massacre remains one of Ontario's darkest crimes, not just because of the number of lives lost, but because of the intimacy of it. It wasn't strangers killing strangers. It was friends turning on each other, loyalty twisted into something lethal. When the dust settled, the Bandidos Ontario chapter was dead. The RCMP called it the beginning of the end for the gang's presence in Canada. But what ended on that farm wasn't just a club. It was the illusion that outlaw honor still meant anything.
Kingston, Ontario, June 30th, 2009. It was a still morning along the Rideau Canal, where the water moves as slowly as glass. A black Nissan Sentra sat submerged beneath the surface at the Kingston Mills locks. At first, it looked like a tragic accident, a car that had veered off the road, another sad story of summer night driving gone wrong. But when divers pulled the vehicle from the water, what they found told a much darker story. Inside were 4 bodies, 3 teenage sisters, and another woman, older, all from the same family. The headlines called it an honor killing. The police called it murder. And for Canada, it became one of the most haunting family tragedies in modern memory. The Shafia family had arrived in Canada just 2 years earlier, a large Afghan-born family searching for peace after years of exile. There was Mohammed Shafia, the patriarch, a wealthy businessman with 2 wives, Tuba Yaya and Rona Amir Mohammed, his first wife, living quietly within the household. Along with them were 7 children, including the eldest daughters, Zainab, Sahar, and Giti. They had settled in Montreal, adjusting to life in a country that was free, open, and vastly different from the world they'd known before. But freedom, for the Shafia daughters, came at a price.
Zainab, Sahar, and Giti were teenagers, curious, bright, outspoken. They wanted what most young people in Canada wanted: friends, music, love, and choice. But inside their home, choice was not something freely given. Their father and brother, Hamad, ruled with strict control. They monitored their phones, their friendships, even their clothes. When Sahar was caught talking to a boy, her father called her a whore. When Zainab tried to leave home once, she was dragged back. And Rona, the first wife, childless, kind, and trapped in a marriage that no longer included her, saw what was happening and tried to intervene. She became a quiet witness to a storm building inside the house. By early summer of 2009, that storm had broken open. Zainab had married a young Pakistani man her father despised. The family attended the wedding out of obligation, but behind the smiles, rage simmered. Within days, the marriage was annulled under pressure from her parents. The shame in their eyes was unforgivable. What came next was planned carefully, deliberately, not in a moment of anger, but with chilling precision.
Late in the night of June 29th, the family began their return trip from Niagara Falls to Montreal. They never made it home. In the early hours of June 30th, the Nissan Sentra carrying Zainab, Sahar, Giti, and Rona plunged into the canal near Kingston Mills. Another car, a Lexus, belonging to Mohammed Shafia and driven by his son, Hamid, followed close behind. What exactly happened in those moments isn't fully known, but investigators later pieced together a story that leaves little doubt. The 4 women were dead before the car even hit the water. When police found the wreck, Mohammed and Tuba played the part of grieving parents. They told officers it must have been an accident, that the girls had gone on a late-night drive and never returned. But detectives noticed inconsistencies almost immediately. There were no skid marks leading to the canal. The gear was in neutral, and the path from the road to the water required multiple sharp turns, impossible to make by mistake. It was the beginning of one of the most detailed homicide investigations in Ontario's history. The Shafia's public mask began to slip under questioning. Mohammed spoke of his daughters in ways no grieving father should: angry, dismissive, disgusted. He called them whores, traitors, and corrupt. He told investigators he was not sad, only betrayed. The deeper police dug, the clearer it became that what happened wasn't an accident at all. It was punishment, and it had been meticulously orchestrated.
Hidden surveillance recordings captured the family's conversations in the days after the murders. In one, Mohammed can be heard saying, "Even if they come back to life 100 times, I would do it again. This is my honor." Those words became the spine of the case. Within a month, Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yaya, and Hamid Shafia were arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The Crown's case was clear. The parents and son conspired to kill the 3 daughters and Rona because they believed the women had shamed their family
by embracing Western freedoms, by laughing too loudly, by choosing love for themselves, by simply wanting to live. The trial began in 2011, drawing attention from around the world. In the courtroom, the contrast was staggering. 3 teenage girls, bright, modern, Canadian, and a mother figure who tried to protect them, all murdered by those sworn to love them. The defense argued the deaths were accidental, the result of panic or miscalculation. But the evidence told a different story. GPS data showed both family cars near the canal that night. Damage to the Lexus matched the Sentra's rear bumper, suggesting one car pushed the other into the water. And the autopsies confirmed what investigators had suspected. The victims had been dead before the car sank. After 3 months of testimony, the jury took just 15 hours to decide. All 3 Shafias were found guilty on all counts. Automatic life sentences, no chance of parole for 25 years. For the city of Kingston and for Canada, the verdict was a kind of reckoning. The case forced the country to confront the intersection of culture, control, and violence. It sparked nationwide conversation about honor-based violence, about how systems can miss the signs when fear hides behind family walls. But for those who knew the girls, their friends at school, their teachers, the verdict couldn't bring them back. They remembered Zainab's laughter, Sahar's kindness, Geeti's restless curiosity. They remembered Rona's quiet bravery, a woman who stayed behind, hoping to protect the daughters she'd come to love as her own. In the end, they all died for defiance, for wanting to live their own lives. Today, the Kingston Mills Lock still looks peaceful. Tourists walk its trails. The water flows silently past the place where the Sentra once rested. But the story hasn't faded. At memorials and vigils, candles are still lit for the 4 women, Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona. Their names carved into the stone of remembrance and the conscience of a country that vowed never to look away again. The Shafia family murders remain one of Ontario's darkest crimes, not only because of its cruelty, but because of the cold conviction behind it. It was violence disguised as virtue, love twisted into control, and in the end, it revealed a truth as old as humanity itself, that sometimes the deadliest threats don't come from strangers in the dark, but from those who call themselves family. That's the story of the Shafia family murders, and it reminds us, honor should never be a weapon. It was a Good Friday afternoon in April of 1992 in St. Catharines, Ontario. The sky was the color of pale steel and the streets were quiet. The kind of day where families were heading home, shops were closing early, and teenagers were just starting their long weekend. Kristen French was one of them. 15 years old, bright, athletic, and full of that restless confidence that comes from being right on the edge of adulthood. She had just left Holy Cross Secondary School, her school books tucked under her arm, her long brown hair hanging loose. She was walking home along a familiar route, the same route she'd walked dozens of times before. But that afternoon, she never made it home. The car that pulled up beside her looked harmless. A beige sedan, nothing special. Inside, a man and a woman smiled. They looked ordinary, friendly even. The woman leaned out the window and asked for directions. Kristen stepped closer to help, polite and unsuspecting. It was a small, normal gesture, something any of us might do. But in that moment, the trap closed. The man grabbed her from behind. She fought, hard, dropping her books onto the sidewalk. Within seconds, she was pulled into the car. The door slammed, and the sedan sped away. The entire abduction took less than 30 seconds. A couple of witnesses saw a struggle, but couldn't react in time. And just like that, a bright, normal afternoon in suburban Ontario became the beginning of one of Canada's darkest true crime stories.
The man was Paul Bernardo. The woman beside him was Karla Homolka. To the outside world, they were an attractive, well-dressed couple in their 20s. She worked as a veterinarian assistant. He was a smooth-talking accountant. But beneath that veneer was something monstrous. They were already responsible for the death of Karla's younger sister, Tammy, a year earlier, a crime they had staged to look like an accident. They had also abducted and murdered another young girl, Leslie Mahaffey, less than a year before Kristen. Now they were hunting again. For 3 days, Kristen was held captive in the couple's home in Port Dalhousie, near the shore of Lake Ontario. What happened there defies simple description. Bernardo filmed much of the abuse. He forced Kristen to say her name, to call him by his, to pretend everything was normal. Karla helped orchestrate it, cutting Kristen's hair, playing the role of both accomplice and tormentor. When it was over, they strangled her with a noose. Her body was found on April 30th, dumped in a ditch near Burlington. She had been missing for 12 days. The brutality of it shook the country. Ontario was still reeling from the disappearance of Leslie Mahaffey the year before. Now it was clear that something far worse was unfolding, a pattern of predation hiding behind middle-class normalcy. The newspapers called them the Ken and Barbie Killers. The nickname stuck, though it trivialized the horror behind it. For nearly 3 years, investigators struggled to connect the dots. Paul Bernardo was already known to police in Scarborough. He'd been the prime suspect in a series of sexual assaults throughout the late 1980s. But a combination of jurisdictional gaps, slow DNA testing, and a lack of communication between police forces had let him slip through. When the DNA results finally came back in early 1993, the truth surfaced. Bernardo was the Scarborough rapist, and much worse. On February 17, 1993, police arrested him at his home. When officers entered, they found videotapes hidden behind ceiling insulation, recordings of the crimes. They were worse than anyone could have imagined. Those tapes would later become central evidence, not just against Bernardo, but against Karla Homolka herself. Homolka struck a deal with prosecutors. She would testify against Bernardo in exchange for a 12-year sentence for manslaughter. It was a plea bargain that would haunt Canada for decades. Because when the tapes were later reviewed, they showed her as a willing participant, not the terrified victim she claimed to be. But by then, the deal was done. There was no taking it back. Paul Bernardo went to trial in 1995. The courtroom was packed. Victims' families, journalists, curious onlookers, and police officers who'd spent years chasing shadows. Bernardo sat expressionless through the proceedings. The tapes were played in closed sessions to spare the public the details. Outside, people lit candles for Kristen and Leslie. They wept, prayed, and waited for justice. When the verdict came, there was no suspense left. Bernardo was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and several other crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years.
later declared a dangerous offender, ensuring he will never be released. Homolka, meanwhile, served her 12 years and was released in 2005. Her freedom remains a point of outrage, a reminder that justice can sometimes feel like a compromise too hard to swallow.
For the families, the grief never really ended. Kristen's parents, Doug and Donna French, carried themselves with quiet grace through years of court hearings and media attention. They never sensationalized their daughter's story. They simply wanted her remembered for who she was: kind, determined, funny, and full of life. Every April, vigils are held in her memory and in Leslie's. At Holy Cross Secondary School, a memorial garden blooms each spring, its plaque reading, "To remember and to promise, never again." The murder of Kristen French changed how Canada thinks about safety, policing, and the nature of evil. It led to reforms in DNA testing, better coordination between police departments, and stronger victim support systems. But beyond all that, it left a scar on the collective memory, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can wear smiles. They can live next door. They can drive past a teenager on her way home from school and change everything. Today, St. Catherine's looks the same as it did that spring. Quiet, suburban, safe. The streets are lined with cherry trees. The same route Kristen walked is still there. Kids still head home from school at the same hour, books in their arms, earbuds in their ears. But for those who remember 1992, there's always a shadow under that sunlight. A reminder that safety, like innocence, can disappear in an instant. The story of Kristen French isn't just a tale of cruelty. It's a story about resilience, of parents who refuse to let their daughter be reduced to a headline, of a community that still keeps her name alive, and of a country that learned, painfully, what happens when systems fail to protect the vulnerable. That's the story of Kristen French, a girl who should have made it home that day, and whose memory still walks that road, in every parent's worry, and in every promise we make to never forget.
Woodstock, Ontario, April 8, 2009. 8-year-old Victoria Stafford left her elementary school just after 3 p.m. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind kids wait all winter for. She waved to her friends, skipped toward home with her pink Hannah Montana backpack bouncing behind her. She never made it back. At first, it seemed impossible. Woodstock was small, safe, the kind of town where people still held doors and knew each other by name. But within hours, parents were pulling their kids inside, because the security camera outside a nearby high school showed something chilling. A woman, young, blonde, carrying a white purse, walking hand in hand with Tori. The girl seemed calm, the woman composed. And then they disappeared from view. The woman was later identified as Terry Lynn McClintock, 18 years old. Beside her, unseen in that clip, sat Michael Rafferty, 28, her boyfriend. What unfolded next was one of Ontario's most heartbreaking crimes. For more than 3 months, police combed the province. They searched rivers, fields, and abandoned houses. Tips flooded in, vigils filled with stuffed animals and candles lined Woodstock's Main Street. Tori's mother, Tara MacDonald, made tearful public pleas, but each week that passed pulled hope further away.
In May, McClintock was arrested on unrelated charges. Under interrogation, she cracked. She told detectives everything. She said Rafferty had wanted a young girl. He'd picked Tori because she looked trusting. McClintock lured her with the promise of seeing puppies. They drove for hours. What happened afterward, in a secluded field near Mount Forest, can't be softened. Tori was assaulted and killed with a hammer. Her body was hidden under rocks and garbage bags. Police recovered her remains on July 19, 2009, 103 days after she vanished. The trials that followed tore at the province's soul. McClintock pled guilty to first-degree murder and received life with no parole for 25 years. Rafferty, tried separately, was also convicted of first-degree murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping. He, too, was sentenced to life with no parole for 25 years. But justice couldn't fill the silence Tori left behind. Her father said the worst part wasn't knowing what happened. It was knowing who did it. Two adults, perfectly capable of choice, who'd seen a child and decided her life was theirs to take. Today, a memorial garden blooms at Woodstock's Victoria Park. Children play beside pink flowers planted in her memory. Every April, ribbons go up around lampposts, bright purple, her favorite color. Tori's story became a catalyst for change. Conversations about parole reform, community awareness, and the darkness that can hide behind ordinary smiles. In the end, she remains frozen in time, a little girl with a pink backpack, walking into a world she trusted. And it's that trust that haunts Ontario still.
April 23, 2018. A clear spring afternoon on Yonge Street, Toronto. Pedestrians filled the sidewalks, office workers on lunch break, mothers pushing strollers, students heading to class. It was an ordinary weekday. And then, without warning, the world tilted. A white rental van jumped the curb near Finch Avenue. For 10 city blocks, it plowed through the crowd at speeds over 60 kilometers an hour. People screamed and scattered, but there was nowhere to go. By the time it stopped, 11 people were dead and 15 injured. The driver stepped out calmly, holding what looked like a gun, then knelt as police moved in, surrendering without a shot fired. His name was Alec Minassian, a 25-year-old computer science student. No criminal record, no history of violence. Online, he'd posted cryptic messages about incels, men who blamed women for their loneliness. He praised earlier mass killers, framing his own act as revenge. It was ideology turned to obsession, a digital echo chamber made real in blood and concrete. For Toronto, the attack shattered a sense of invulnerability. The city had endured tragedies before, fires, storms, even terrorism. But this was different. This was intimate. It happened on a street everyone knew, in daylight, to people who had done nothing more than exist in public. The investigation moved quickly. Minassian confessed on camera, calling the attack a rebellion against society. He described his van as a weapon of war. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with autism spectrum disorder, but the court ruled it did not impair his ability to understand right from wrong. His trial began in 2020, held virtually due to the pandemic. Families of victims watched from home as prosecutors played footage of the van's path mapped over Google Street View, block by block, body by body. In 2021, the verdict came, guilty on all counts of first-degree murder and attempted murder. life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The judge called it a deliberate act of terrorism against humanity. For the victims, students, retirees, newlyweds, the names now line a quiet stretch of Yonge Street, remembered every April with white roses. Today, that sidewalk has been rebuilt. There are benches, trees, and small bronze plaques with their names. Toronto calls it the Path of Remembrance. And when the wind moves through the young trees, you can almost hear what the city promised that day. Hate will not drive here again. Every one of these stories began the same way, with someone who thought it could never happen here, in a farmhouse, in a family home, on a quiet street. Ontario remembers its tragedies in silence. 8 men in a field, 4 women in a canal, a teenage girl who never made it home, a child taken for no reason, 11 lives stolen on a city sidewalk. Each name echoes through time, carried by the people who refuse to forget. What remains after crimes like these isn't just grief, it's awareness. It's the understanding that evil doesn't wear a mask or wait for the night. It walks beside us, smiles politely, and asks for directions. If you've stayed with me through these stories, thank you for listening and for remembering. Please subscribe to Northern Nightmares for more stories told with empathy, truth, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Stay safe out there. And remember, the brightest places can cast the darkest shadows.